cardinal point when we're talking about health is that we always point to what we call or what we term the central governing system of the human body. If you've been on these webinars for any period of time, you would know by now that our body is controlled. We have 12 systems in the body, but those 12 systems are controlled by three systems, three uppermost systems. The nervous system, represented by the hypothalamus, the endocrine system, and the immune system, which control our 60+ trillion cells. Of course, your emotions, your mind and your emotions actually play a huge role on affecting the nervous system. So all these things have to be in alignment. All these things have to be working well. These systems have to be working well for your cardiovascular system to work well, for your gut, your gastrointestinal system to work well, your immune system. These all are controlled by these three systems. And these three systems have to be in good, close communication between each other. And if you've watched or attended or listened to any of our webinars that dealt with the endocrine system or fat loss and weight loss, or even inflammation, or even antioxidants, aging, all those things that we talked about, you see that the endocrine system plays a very key central role. And if I can get to the next slide, we'll be able to. Okay, there you go. And here's a quote I got from this really good book that I've always touted, I've always made a lot of noise about. Basically, hormones are crucial to our very existence. They are the ultimate coordinators, keeping all our bodily parts and functions regulated and directed toward the same purpose, whether that purpose is as basic as eating or as complicated as reproduction. They are, in effect, the handmaidens of the brain, which is the commander-in-chief of all body operations. And this, of course, is by Dr. Robert Greene. And here's his book here. I tell you, this book really, really opened my eyes to the endocrine system. I tell you, all my training, all my practice in medical school did not give me the kind of understanding I got in this book that, like I said, has really, really helped to open my eyes to understanding stuff. And it's written not for the doctor, the healthcare professional. It's written primarily for the layperson, for him or her to understand how her body works, what with regards to in the endocrine system. And I think this statement up here says it all. Finally, a doctor who gets it. This book is a must-read by Susan Somers. And here's Dr. Robert Greene. And here's the thing, folks, because I think Sherry once mentioned that we needed to have something on women's issues. We needed to have someone to talk to us on women's issues. So obviously, my first thought was to go to Dr. Greene because I was like, he really has a great handle on this thing. But the challenge was how to get him on a webinar for free. So, after consulting with a couple of people we shared, we finally came across a solution. And so we did to him what we usually do to big shots around here. We got him, tied him to a tree, and we had Sherry read off her her worst jokes to him until he submitted. That didn't take long.
Oh, thanks a lot.
He was more than happy, even when we sent him. All it took was an email, really, explaining what we did, and he was more than happy to help out. And this, from what I understand, will be the first in a series of webinars that he will be doing for us because of it pertain to health. So we're very, very grateful to have him. Sherry, you want to go ahead and introduce him?
Yes, I would be honored to. Okay, Robert Greene, MD, is the medical director of the Schur Institute for Reproductive Medicine in Northern California. He is a board certified by both the American Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology and the ABOG Division of Reproductive Endocrinology and Fertility. Dr. Greene is also a fellow of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. He is a sought-after lecturer for healthcare practitioners, from OBGYNs and family practice providers to neurologists and psychiatrists on subjects ranging from hormonal influences on blood-brain flow, sexual dysfunction, postpartum depression, chronic pelvic pain, migraine headaches, and epilepsy. Dr. Greene has published numerous articles in the medical and scientific literature fields. He has also appeared on NBC's news magazine Dateline and on the pages of Self, Glamour, Life Extension Magazine, Cosmopolitan, Body and Soul Magazine, and the books Women in Overdrive by Nora Isaacs and Menopause and the Mind by Claire Warga. He wrote the foreword to the best-selling book The Sexy Years by Suzanne Summers and was featured in her recent book Ageless. He is the author of Perfect Balance, Look Younger, Stay Sexy and Feel Great, Perfect Hormone Balance for Pregnancy, and Happy Baby, Healthy Mom Pregnancy Journal, as well as Perfect Hormone Balance for Fertility. Wow, that is a lot.
Yeah.
Getting to have him on this webinar is the next best thing to getting to meet him in person, and we are so honored that he is with us here tonight. So we'll turn it over to you, Dr. Robert Greene.
You're both very, very kind, in fact, kinder than I deserve, but thank you very much. Truly, it is an honor to be here, and one thing that I would absolutely encourage is I prefer for things to be very interactive. So if people do have questions, you should be able to either, instant message those to Sherry, and she could interrupt at any time, or we could do them at the end. But I was amazed at how shy people were when we were starting out, because we can see there's well over 100 people on there. So
Right.
I do want to encourage people to interact at any point. Were you going to say something, David?
No, I was just agreeing with what you were saying.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and let me give you just a little bit of background so that people have a rough idea of what the flavor of tonight's discussion is really, and I do hope it becomes a discussion, is really intended to be. That my training is in the field of what we call reproductive endocrinology and infertility. What that means in a nutshell is that I'm a hormone specialist, but I think what makes things more interesting by today's standards is that for over 15 years now, besides my clinical practice, I've been involved in a lot of research on different ways that hormones interact with the brain, what I like to call the hormone-brain connection. And that's what really has made this a fascinating field, because for over 50 things like SPECT scanning and PET scanning and functional MRI that allow us to look at what's going on inside the brain and then what people are able to report to us that they're actually feeling. And that's what's really taken this science to a whole new level now that really allows us to talk about things that, that in mind, what I'd like to do is really take the time to review the latest science with you. And some of it is going to be very, very different from things you've heard. And I invite you to challenge me and make me prove it to you. The latest scientific tools that we're able to provide the level of proof that takes even the most ardent skeptic into becoming a true believer in the power of not only the technology but the meaning behind it. A perspective. As a man in a field that's primarily geared towards women, I've often been faced by people talking about how menopause is natural and therefore we really have no business treating or interfering with a natural process. But in reality, the earliest human ancestors, as we can see, rarely made it past age 20. And then as human technology became greater, adapt, people began to learn how to work with metals. You see that a significant, as recently as the Roman Empire, the vast majority of people died well into their 30s, and therefore what we see today is a very shift in the way human beings live, because today we see that well over 80% of people are going to live well beyond their reproductive years. And it's really only because of very unnatural things like modern sanitation, better nutrition, antibiotics, that people are living such a long life. And now it's really important that we focus or refocus our lifespan rather than simply how do we extend the life as we know it. With that in mind, there's been a true revolution in the field of endocrinology, or hormones as most people know them. At the time when I went through medical school, which I'm pleased to say isn't that long ago, we were taught there's about a handful of different hormone-producing organs that make about 24 different hormones, and that's all we thought we needed to know. In reality, as we understand it today, virtually every part of the body makes hormones, even fat cells, which were once considered only a calorie storage system. We understand fat cells alone produce at least 20 to 30 unique hormones that really weren't even discovered until the last few years. And I was telling David during one of our recent discussions that the list of hormones continues to grow. I keep a running list, and it's approaching 200 different hormones that even a nerd scientist like me couldn't even name half of them, because some of them we don't even know what they do. And so the important thing is that there's more and more that we're learning about the endocrine system, and that you don't need to focus on the details. What I want you to focus on is the importance of how hormones interact with one another. And the best way I have come to describe hormones and the way they interact in the body is if you can imagine them as if they're different elements on a mobile. A mobile, I think, is a perfect metaphor for hormones because everything on a mobile, as we understand, affects everything else. And a mobile also is influenced by its environment. If it's windy, if it's raining, these can all influence how a mobile is interacting. And with our hormones, we're influenced by the environment as well. Whether or not we're feeling under pressure, whether we've recently eaten, how well we've slept, all of these things affect our hormones, and all of our hormones influence one another. And ironically, we don't have a term to describe when all the hormones are in proper alignment. Ironically, that's what we call a sense of wellness, or for lack of a better term, I call it perfect balance, because the reality is when there is perfect balance, sometimes there is a little more or a little less of a given hormone, but everything shifts and stays balanced. But when things become way out of balance, that's when symptoms occur, and that's when we really need to interact. Now, rather than mention all the different hormones, what I tell people to think about hormones as if they're in 4 different groups. We're all very familiar with the fight or flight hormones. You know, these are the stress hormones. And, you know, the fight or flight hormones are the ones that really, you know, create that feeling of stress. And these are the ones that can be very, very disruptive to us. But there's a whole host of other hormones, most of which don't have great names. And so I've taken it upon myself to come up with names, and some of them I've actually created the names for, and others you might find in other places. And I would credit the authors where I could if I could. But besides the fight or flight hormones, I want you to think of 3 other groups of hormones. One group I like to call the rest and digest hormones. Rest and digest hormones are the ones that really are involved in, you know, maintaining your calories, helping you absorb food, letting your brain know when you're hungry, telling fat cells when they should be releasing glucose. These are the rest and digest hormones that keep your fuel system going. Then there's a group of hormones that I like to call the tend and befriend hormones. These are the hormones that help maintain things like growth and development and repair of injury when it's going on. There have also, believe it or not, been a whole host of hormones that seem to be involved in bonding and social relationships, and these are all classified in that group of tend and befriend hormones. But the ones we're going to be focusing on tonight are the ones that are often referred to as the sex hormones, and that's kind of a misleading term, and I like to instead refer to them as the mate and relate hormones because they are the ones that are about reproduction. They're the ones that get us primed for reproduction. They're the ones that guide our reproductive lives for both men and women, and they're the hormone levels that fail as we start to reach our later and post-reproductive years. So you could think of these 4 groups of hormones: fight or flight, rest and digest, tend and befriend, and mate and relate hormones. And we'll go back to that list from time to time, especially with questions if they come up later. Now, what's important is the group of mate and relate, or sex hormones, are all fat-soluble hormones. Most of them are what we call steroid hormones that are very difficult to build. You could see them here. They look like these different types of chicken wire diagrams. This is estradiol, the primary estrogen. This is testosterone, again, a hormone that we're all very familiar with. But what's really ironic is because these hormones are so difficult to manufacture, what our body does is it manufactures a lot of this stuff here, what we call cholesterol. And cholesterol is basically the building block from which all of these hormones are manufactured. And I'll explain why that's important, because of the fact that cholesterol itself, all these other hormones, and the reason is it's very easy for our body to take a big molecule and make it smaller. Again, to go back to a metaphor, you could think of cholesterol as if it were a cluster of grapes, where each carbon atom is represented by a grape. Totally, as we know it, there are 27 of the grapes in cholesterol. What happens is certain parts of your body can remove different ones of these grapes to create these other hormones further down the chain. There's progesterone here. Cortisol, which is one of the stress hormones, is made out of here. There's androstenedione, which some people made by just plucking off different grapes. And this becomes very important, especially when we get to the portion of tonight's talk where we're going to talk about bioidentical hormones and what makes them different from other hormones. And a great example, yes, please.
This is a question that's always bothered me.
Yeah, go for it.
You're probably going to answer it along the way, but we do know in many cases that, like you mentioned in your book, that certain hormones diminish with age, especially with the estradiol. To build estradiol and other hormones like that, and we have an abundance of cholesterol in our diet, why is there a problem there?
Well, it's a great question, and you know, there's no clear answer on this, and the best any of us could ever do is theorize, but I've got my own personal theory that it's interesting to me that as we age, cholesterol levels tend to be rising. And again, the analogy that I draw is, since cholesterol is really a building block, I think of it, imagine if you have a factory making bricks, and you're using those bricks to make houses. And then once the neighborhoods fill, you stop making houses, but the factory is still. And I believe that's what goes on with cholesterol. Clearly, this is only a theory, but it's one that I think explains a lot of what we go through, because one of the things that anyone that's had cholesterol problems could explain and verify if you ever talk to them about it, is it's very difficult to lower your cholesterol simply through diet alone. It's estimated that only about 10 to 15% of the cholesterol that's in the bloodstream is from the diet. And so for many people, it's actually their liver that's overproducing cholesterol, or you might think of it as if their body is under-converting it to other things. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. All right. Thank you.
Absolutely. And so getting back to the concept of bioidentical hormones, I want to make a point here that I think for most functions is really very much of a precursor to a hormone, because when testosterone enters a cell into the body, it typically goes one of two courses. Either something is plucked off of it, and basically these are chemical molecules that make it something called DHT, dihydrotestosterone, or believe it or not, testosterone will have a couple of more carbon atoms plucked off it, just like grapes coming off the vine, and testosterone is converted to estradiol. And it's really interesting because what we see in identical hormones, it gives our body the freedom to convert it into whatever it's necessary to have in that part of the body at that time, rather than when we chemically modify a molecule so that it can only go in one direction or the other and then assume that we know exactly how much is needed. Now, with that in mind, is there a question?
That's good. I just said that's good.
Oh, okay. With that in mind, I think it's really interesting to compare. If we're looking at something just like estrogen, the average estrogen level is so high during prenatal life because basically that reflects what's going on in the developing body of the baby and also in the body of the woman that's carrying the pregnancy. But look at how fascinating this is. A baby at the time of birth has estrogen levels that are equivalent, literally equivalent, to a woman that's in her reproductive years. And it's not until roughly about 3 to 7 days afterwards that the estrogen levels start to fall in that infant child. Now, again, this is very important because one of the things we're going to be talking about during tonight's presentation is the important influence that estrogen has on the brain. And this is important both during development. It's also important during maturation when we're going through puberty and becoming young adults. And then it's also important in protecting the brain as we age, and that's a big part of what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Another point I want to make is the fact that if you notice, men actually tend to have as much or more estrogen as women during their reproductive years. I point this out to them. And interestingly enough, a man typically has anywhere from 2 to 4 times more estrogen in his bloodstream than a woman in menopause that's not on hormone therapy. And this is one of the reasons that women are more susceptible to certain age-related changes in their brain, we believe, than men are. And I think this is a very important distinction and one that I can tell you has really gotten the attention of the neurology or the brain scientist community, that field in medicine. Now, with that in mind, just to give you a little bit of an idea, hormones are things that do different things in different parts of the body. You see that, for instance, testosterone has functions in muscle, has functions regarding the voice box, has functions regarding the skin in terms of sexual hair distribution and beard growth. It affects bones and cartilages. Interestingly enough, testosterone affects the immune system, the nervous system. There's even benefits to the heart and the red blood cells. These are all really important. Estrogen tends to target somewhat different tissues. Breast tissue, uterine tissue for women. Obviously, men don't have a uterus. Fat tissue, it tends to affect where fat cells tend to accumulate glucose and calories. It affects the heart and the blood vessels. notice testosterone affects the heart but not really the blood vessels. And David can tell you, because he and I were both trained to believe that testosterone causes heart disease, but we testosterone level. And again, this is very different from what we were taught, and you could still find in textbooks that were published in the not-too-recent past. Estrogen, again, bone and cartilage, because one of the important distinctions I like to make is that I'm having a little trouble with my drawing tool, so believe it or not, I don't have a quiver, but it's coming up as a jagged line. But the thing that's really amazing to me, I tried to circle the nervous system there, is, believe it or not, even when testosterone, about 80%, that's 80% of the testosterone is usually converted to estrogen in the brain. So estrogen is far more powerful in the brain than testosterone is. And one of the things that men have is they have the benefit of having more testosterone, which is estrogen.
So now, does that help out in degenerative conditions? Because I understand that, I don't want you to get ahead of yourself now, but having more estradiol, and I've read somewhere where estrogen helps helps brain cells recover, to reproduce, to grow back.
Absolutely, absolutely. And my career is how these hormones influence different disorders. We see that certain disorders are far more common in males, and others are far more common in females. And even when a disorder is present in equal numbers in both men and women, it tends to affect men and women differently. And then we see other brain-related illnesses that affect women differently during their reproductive years versus their post-reproductive years. And this is part of what's really get to understand this better. Instead of needing to just develop new drugs, we often are finding that if we can just have greater influence on what's going on hormonally, we can influence different illnesses in a very positive fashion.
Wow.
Yeah, even a condition like with epilepsy are far more likely to have seizures during their menstrual cycle. And
why is that?
Pardon?
Why is that?
Well, it gets kind of complicated, and for different people it's differently, but it's believed to be a combination of the rapid withdrawal of estrogen as well as the fascinating that one of the things we often do to help get greater control of epilepsy in women is we try to stabilize their hormone levels so that the other medications that are used to control their seizures could be adjusted more easily. So one of the important points that I think is brought out, especially even when we use an example like epilepsy, is that if you look at a hormone like estrogen, women have fluctuating levels. Those levels will vary, week to week or day to day during the course of a month. Now, superimposed on that, again, going back to what's going on with the mobile, keep in mind that estrogen and progesterone are fluctuating throughout the menstrual cycle. And then superimposed upon that, we see that testosterone levels tend to fall just gradually year to year. And these combinations of things explain why, for instance, someone has different symptoms at this stage in their life with their menstrual cycles than they might have during this stage in their life. Now, for men, we tend to have very stable estrogen levels day to day, week to week, year to year, and gradual drops in testosterone with a not quite as steep downfall as women occur. But for men, it often gets to the point where they become symptomatic as well, and we're going to talk about the guys tonight, too. They're going to get not quite equal time because men aren't quite as complicated, but we're going to address testosterone replacement in men as well. And this is a fascinating study to me because one of the things that I point out is besides having the reproductive cycles, times of the day, and we've also found that hormones shift during different seasons. And I think this is particularly fascinating because even though humans don't have mating seasons like many of the other animals, we do have shifts in these mate and relate hormones. And you could see that looking at, for instance, men will tend to have higher levels of testosterone and estrogen during the months of the year where there's greater sunlight and higher temperatures. And even women in menopause, women that are past their reproductive years, will have measurable changes in these hormone levels according to how the seasons are changing as well. Now, with that in mind, I like to point out that there are definitely some ways that men and women age similarly, and there's other ways that they age that are very differently. And we're going to try to address a little bit of both of those because I think it's very important, that women have a longer life expectancy than men do. And as a result of that, they have a greater risk of experiencing disability, especially during their later years than men. But now that we're getting better at diagnosing and treating heart disease and some of the other illnesses that have often resulted in premature death in men, we're finding that men are starting to catch up. And you hear greater discussions of things like osteoporosis in men. And we're going to talk about why you're probably going to hear more and more discussion about hormone replacement in men to minimize the effects of aging as well. Now, with that in mind, getting back to that earlier slide where we were talking about how often people would live into menopause, this is fascinating to me. Not only do we have nearly 60 million postmenopausal women in the United States, but look at this. We've got well over 4 million people over the age of 85. Now, clearly we're an aging population. We find people are delaying retirement. We're finding that we're having a greater need to remain active. And most importantly, we want quality of life, which involves usually independence. So maintaining peak brain health, I think, is one of the most critical challenges we have to creating a healthy aging population. Now, it is important that we always have to go to biological plausibility. And I think biological plausibility is how we should always be guiding our science, because one of the things I often say to people is that if you can't come up with theories on how one problem is or one thing is causing another, you can't really develop treatments for that problem. And so we really have to have good theories. And what's so important is I feel people are given a terrible message today to learn and live with their symptoms. And one of my mantras that I repeat to my patients and to people that attend my lectures over and over is that symptoms matter. It's only in women's health that women are taught to embrace their symptoms. As David could tell you, in every other aspect of medicine, we're taught to listen to our patients' symptoms and to come up with treatments. And it's only when women are either pregnant, or which we might talk about during another session, or when women are aging, that they're taught to embrace their symptoms until they ultimately go away. But what we understand today is that ignoring those symptoms leads to tissue changes. And the early tissue changes involve things like vaginal atrophy, bladder dysfunction, and loosening of the skin or wrinkles. And those are bothersome symptoms to many people, and they can be a tremendous impact on quality of life. But these other symptoms, if you keep letting these symptoms go untreated, eventually they'll go away. But based on current evidence, what's happened by the time they've gone away are significant bone loss, changes to the cardiovascular system, and very important changes in the brain. Because the reason I say that that's so important is we've developed all sorts of treatments to try to strengthen bones that have been damaged. People have all sorts of treatments to try to reverse heart disease or even transplant hearts from one person to another. There's really no treatment to try to reverse neuron loss or damage to the brain. So symptoms matter, and ironically, that's such an empowering message, because that's a way of telling people, you know what? You can feel better today and be healthier tomorrow. You don't have to choose between one or the other. We need to start merging the two together. And the way to do that is to first start having a better understanding of the symptoms and what they mean, and then applying what that knowledge tells us into how we can individualize the treatment. So truly, when people are completely asymptomatic and feeling great, they very often don't need any hormonal correction, regardless of what most blood tests or other tests tell us. But when people are feeling not so great, when they have symptoms, what we need is we need to have good diagnostic and tools and good insights in order to figure out how to relieve those symptoms and do it in the healthiest way possible. It's going to give us the quality of life today as well as the improved lifestyle in the future. And what I want to focus on for just a few moments is one very common example, which is the hot flash. What brings on a hot flash is really how well someone is able to maintain a certain body temperature within a thermoneutral zone. And what happens is during our younger years, when we've got sort of what some people would consider peak hormone levels, people can generate, tremendous amounts of body heat if they need to. And so this is why you see young people that go out in the winter with no jacket on and they say they're not cold, while grandma's putting a sweater on in the winter, or in the summer, even though it's 80 degrees outside. Is that what ends up happening is during the younger years, we're able to adjust to these, outside changes. But what happens is when women are low on estrogen, they tend to have a much narrower thermoneutral zone. So much smaller changes in either body temperature or an ambient or room temperature can trigger either sweating or shivering that seems inappropriate according to what everyone else in the room may be experiencing. And that is what has commonly been referred to as a hot flash. Now, what's really interesting is in many societies or in many groups of people that talk, they act like hot flashes are the be-all, end-all system to talk about. But ironically, hot flashes vary tremendously from one region to another and from different ethnic groups because of differences in diet and lifestyle. I can tell you, women in Southern California where Sherry live or in Florida have a lot more hot flashes than women in Alaska or Minnesota. And you'll notice that hot flashes vary according to season as well, and it's because of these, these differences in the ambient and room temperatures that really we see this tremendous fluctuation. Now, getting back to part of what David was addressing in the introduction, we know that oxidative stress is one of the things that can damage both the heart as well as the cardiovascular system. And I don't want to frighten anyone, but there have been many studies that show that women with hot flashes have more oxidative stress. They have more free radicals formed that could damage proteins and cells and DNA than women that aren't having hot flashes. And the number of free radicals tends to be in proportion to the frequency and severity of the hot flash intensity. Now, that doesn't mean that every hot flash is a dangerous event, just like every fever isn't. But what happens is if they're happening day after day, week after week, month after month, and often year after year, we do believe that there's cumulative damage. If that alone weren't enough, I'm going to tell you something else that you might find even more powerful. Estradiol, that brain estrogen that's most important, is about 3 times more potent than vitamin E as an antioxidant. So one of the many functions that 17-beta estradiol has is not only to reduce the formation of free radicals, but also reduce the damage that they cause when they are produced. Because the way I describe a free radical to someone is you can imagine a free radical is almost like being a loose spark in the room, that it's going to fly around that room until it hits something that's able to absorb the energy for the spark. And if that spark, hits the wall or something and it's absorbed by the wall, no big deal. But if instead that spark hits you, that's going to hurt. And depending on how big a spark that is, it might really hurt badly. And so what happens is these free radicals, they bounce around in the body and they can damage the DNA, they could damage the cells, they could damage the proteins. So it's important that not only that we minimize the formation of these little chemical sparks, but also that we have little traps to catch them so that when they do appear, that they can then ahead be neutralized as quickly as possible. I'm going to use that as a transition to a slide from one of my earliest research studies back when I was down at UCLA still finishing my training. And this was a study that came out where we were demonstrating here what happens to brain blood flow during a hot flash. Now, the thing that's particularly interesting about this, I was new to brain imaging, but everybody was in the 1990s because that's when it was just discovered. But we all were trying to figure out how to use it, and I was one of the only endocrinologists that was doing research in this field. And when I started looking at these images and I started showing them to brain imaging people without telling them anything about the patient, and I would show them an image just like this one that says during a hot flash, I'd say, what do you think is wrong with this patient? I would get repeatedly the same answer. They would say, this patient looks like they have early Alzheimer's disease. And I said, what makes you say that? And they say, well, there's a dramatic decrease in blood flow, especially in the temporal and parietal region of the brain, which is the area that I'm showing here, and particularly on one side of the brain. And this was fascinating to me because then I tend to be a bit of a wise guy. I tend to say, you know what? This was a 48-year-old lady that was experiencing a hot flash. And here is that same lady after I put her on estrogen therapy. And I watched with astonishment as neurologist after neurologist, their eyes would pop out and say, this is incredible. This is something so different than anything we'd ever seen before. And the thing that's amazing is what I believe happens, and again, this is theory rather than absolute fact at this point, is that the cumulative damage that goes on in this area, it didn't really affect the 48-year-old woman as much as it would an elderly person because her brain would recover between hot flashes, but that there would be small amounts of damage that were accumulating over time, and that over time that may lead to the more dangerous sequelae that we call Alzheimer's disease. And obviously that's a very scary finding. I published this study. It was amazing. I presented this first to my own community, my own subspecialty, and basically it was all rejected as too controversial. And it was interesting. I started, submitting this to neurology journals and neurology societies, and I was getting invitations to speak all over the world about this. And the neurologists were really buying into this, and they were getting very excited about it. Ironically, 2 years after this publication came out, I got a request back from the reproductive endocrinology groups asking if they could publish this information that they had rejected 3 years earlier, because once the neurologists, the brain scientists, said this is really important stuff, all of a sudden my own colleagues in endocrinology said, well, maybe we better be paying attention too. Now, interestingly enough, during my travels, I was lecturing in Japan to the International Menopause Society, and I got a chance to meet Dr. Okura, who is a Japanese reproductive endocrinologist who was doing similar research to myself. And he and I got to spend some time and review data and talk about this. And it was fascinating because we needed an interpreter. And one of the things I mentioned to him is that in the United States, everyone always talks about how women in Japan don't complain of hot flashes. He thought that was very funny because he said that they don't really have a word like hot flash, and it's pretty hard to complain of something if you don't have a word to describe it. But ironically, women in Japan do have tremendous symptoms associated with menopause, but ironically, what they consider one of their primary symptoms is neck and shoulder pain. Now, that's not something that I was ever trained to ask my menopausal patients in the U.S. about. Additionally, they complain of things like dizziness and vertigo, and ironically, when they talk about temperature disturbances, that lists about 4th or 5th on their list. But ironically, what Dr. Okura was finding was the same thing I was finding, is that when Japanese women were starting estrogen, they were having a dramatic improvement in blood flow in the same area of the brain that we were seeing was starved in the hypoestrogenic women in the United States. So a tremendous correlation, even though the underlying symptoms are often very different.
Now, Robert, could you explain the significance of diminished blood flow in the parietal and temporal lobe? What does that mean?
Well, absolutely. What happens is the brain is a very fuel-dependent organ in the body. It needs a constant supply of glucose and oxygen. And what's so interesting about the brain that we didn't really understand until these brain imaging studies came about is that your brain is able to shift blood flow to the area that's active at any given moment. Because the best way to think about the brain is think about it as if it were a university. Some parts of the brain are devoted to movement, others are to sensation, others are to thought and mood, others are to verbal memory. So different areas of the brain have different functions. So for instance, when you're speaking, a different area of your brain is activated than the part of your brain when you're reading, even though those are both considered verbal skills. Now, what's particularly interesting is that this area of the brain, the temporal and parietal lobe, is the area where most of our verbal and short-term memory tends to be centered. So these are the types of things that help us remember the names of different things, and that favorite location that we like to eat dinner at, or our cousin's wife's name, or also things like where you laid your car keys. So what I have come to refer to, the symptoms that women, particularly women that are having hot flashes, often experience, is we call that the whatchamacallit syndrome. Because people that have expressed to me, especially women in menopause, that very often they feel like they're often stumbling trying to find the right word or remember things like a certain phone number that they call very often, and that these are also the things that we see that later on can become even more bothersome and be the earliest signs of a possible impending dementia. So it's important that we realize that symptoms can be very, very important early clues, not only as to which area of the brain might be affected, but also what we might need to do to try to reverse it. Now, with that in mind, hormone therapy was very popular for quite a long time until the Women's Health Initiative has come out. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Women's Health Initiative, but it was a very problematic study for a variety of different reasons. Number one, it had the assumption of one size fits all. So basically, every woman in the study, it didn't matter if she was 50 or if she was 79, they were all, if they were given hormone therapy, they were all given the same exact dose. It didn't matter if she weighed 95 pounds or 295 pounds. It didn't matter what her age was. This was all, as we see it today, an error. And as David could tell you, in medicine, we're always adjusting doses. It's so rare that one size fits all. And even more bothersome, it was also assumed that the one estrogen that was being used in that study would represent all estrogens. And these were some of the flaws in the design, but I think the most important flaw from my perspective as a brain researcher is that women, in order to get into the study, had to be symptom-free. Now, that's shocking to most people, but as a researcher, the reason they designed, and I wasn't involved in designing the study, but the reason they designed the study that way is they wanted to randomly decide who was going to take a hormone and who was going to take a placebo. And they knew that if the person had symptoms and their symptoms went away, the patient and their doctor would very rapidly know which arm of the study they were on. So they sought out specifically women that were symptom-free. And that, in my opinion, was one of the tragic errors, because those people that were symptom-free, based on what we now understand today, are probably people that have already gone through cellular change in the cardiovascular system, in the vertebral system, and also in the brain system. And so the fact that they were symptom-free, one size fits all, and only one type of estrogen tested were all downfalls to the study. But even if you look at the results, the real results weren't as concerning as what was presented through the media. You know, when it came to the issue of, for instance, heart disease, there was estimated to be 7 cases of heart disease per 10,000 women taking a hormone supplement. Now, that's far less than 1%. But most important, that was only when women were taking this specific estrogen with this very foreign type of progesterone. Ironically, when women are taking estrogen alone, there were actually fewer cases of heart disease than women that were taking the placebo. When it came to the breast cancer issue, which is the one that a lot of patients really focus on, there were 8 more cases of breast cancer in women on the combination of estrogen and progesterone out of 10,000 women. And I'm going to talk a little bit about cancer at the end, but the reality is that the women that were taking estrogen alone had 7 fewer cancers than the women taking the placebo. So the reality is it's really not the way it was perceived. And most important is that over the years since the WHI study have come out, there have been various analyses of it. And as we now see it today, if you look here, for instance, you could see that women that were between 50 and 79, there was actually a reduction in heart disease compared to the women that were between 70 and 79. That doesn't mean that the women in this age range aren't good candidates for hormone therapy. It means maybe the dose and the type of hormone should be adjusted to meet their needs. Again, very important, for women that were less than 70 years of age, there was no increase in breast cancer, not even a slight amount. And for women that were in this age range, it's possible that there was a slight increase in the detection of breast cancer, but really no change in the actual breast cancer diagnosis. And so I think it's important that we really start to wade through the facts, and we've seen it slowly changed over the last group of years as more and more analyses have come out. You could see that they've got the HERS trial, the WHI study, and then the pendulum started swinging. And now we see more and more research studies are showing that all estrogens are not the same, and we can't overinterpret the results from this one study. And I think it's very important, too, to point out that really what we're seeing now is that we need to individualize the treatments, and we need to look at the differences between different hormone preparations so we can minimize the risk even further, and then, importantly, individualize the treatment to best meet the needs of our patients. Now, one of the ways that we found to do that is through transdermal delivery of estrogen. What we mean by that, when we say transdermal, it means through the skin. When estrogen is absorbed through the skin, what we see is that virtually all of the risks are virtually gone, that all of the concerns, even though they were slight regarding heart disease and venous thromboembolism, which are blood clots, all of those risks completely disappear when estrogen is absorbed through the skin, as opposed to when estrogen is swallowed in birth control pills. Now, keep in mind, or in menopause preparations as well, that what happens is it's a very different process that I'll talk about in a moment, that when we absorb estrogen through the stomach, it has to go through the liver, and that's where we see that these changes occur that can increase the risk of blood clotting problems and some of the other issues that were raised by these different research studies. And it's simply by changing the type of estrogen so that it's something that can be absorbed through the skin and coming up with different ways to make it absorbable through the skin, we see that we've been able to take that risk away completely. So much so that we see that there's a tremendous upsurgence of interest in transdermal estrogens. Believe it or not, last year, this month, January of 2008, there was a position paper put out by the American Association of Clinical Endocrinologists, or the AACE, that said that basically hormone therapy for women in their early menopausal years has no risk of heart disease and may have even protective effects, and that for any woman that the risks can be absolutely minimized by converting over to transdermal agents. Now, a lot of people don't realize, because it doesn't make headlines when good news comes out like that, but this agency, trying to get them to agree on a statement like this, that's like trying to get a herd of cats to walk single file through a fish market. It's not an easy challenge, but yet that's exactly what they did, is they launched this very strong safety data suggesting that we have to pay greater attention to the route of administration and the type of estrogen. And I would encourage anyone that's dealing with people that aren't aware of it to encourage them to go to the website for the AACE, which is www.aace.com, and you can download that and share it with your own healthcare provider. Now, with that in mind, what we see is that with the transdermal estrogens, we also have reductions in C-reactive protein, which David will tell you we see are associated with reductions in problems, not only heart disease, but it's also believed to reduce the risk of stroke and blood clotting disorders and possibly even some of the cancer-related issues. Transdermal estrogens have no higher risk than placebo, whereas oral estrogens, particularly the very specific type of oral estrogen used in the WHI study, can increase that risk enough to create the small number of adverse findings that was found in the WHI study. And what we believe happens is that when estrogen is absorbed through the liver, it can create these pro-inflammatory chemicals that can then go out through the circulation and tend to wreak havoc throughout the body. One of the other real powerful and interesting things to know is, believe it or not, when you absorb estrogen through the stomach, you're going to lose at least 60%, if not more, just through the process of absorption. Whereas when you go with transdermal absorption of estrogen, your body is absorbing what's necessary for the brain and for the rest of the body to remain healthy. So it's much easier to get what you need, to get as little as you absolutely need. You can adjust the doses much more easily, and even more importantly, create very stable blood levels that tend to relieve symptoms most effectively.
These are creams and patches, right?
Creams, patches. There's also a newer spray that's actually sprayed on the skin and absorbed through the skin through what they call like a patchless patch system. It's using like the liquid bandage technology.
Okay.
One additional point I want to make before we go on to some other things is going back to the idea of how hormones interact with one another. This condition called metabolic syndrome, which is insulin resistance, tends to go up dramatically as women age. Insulin resistance is where the body produces excess amounts of insulin because the body becomes somewhat immune to the effects of insulin. So, higher amounts are produced in order to overcome the resistance. And what's so important to understand is newer research studies are showing that transdermal estrogens can reduce this problem of age-related insulin resistance. What that means is a lot of the weight gain that women experience with aging can be minimized or even reversed. These are a couple of the hormones that I was mentioning earlier that are produced by fat cells, and it's a much more favorable hormonal parameter with transdermal estrogens that people don't find that they have to starve themselves in order to just maintain weight instead of actually gaining. Now, I just want to briefly mention a recent study that got a lot of attention through the New England Journal of Medicine, just came out last month. This was part of what's called the Aphrodite study. There have been a variety of studies that have come out over the last several years showing that testosterone can have very significant and measurable benefits for women, just like it can for men, and it can be administered safely. And I think it's so important that sexual satisfaction is just one of many symptoms that can be relieved through testosterone replacement as well. Because keep in mind, when you give either men or women bioidentical or physiologically identical testosterone, you're also giving the body something it can easily convert over to more estradiol if more estradiol is necessary. So it's time that we really got more comfortable talking about sexual satisfaction. One of the things I've been involved in research studies on sexual dysfunction, and I think it's so bothersome that people are so comfortable passing out Viagra to make it easier for men to remain sexually active well into their aging process. At the same time, they're trying to take hormones away from women to make sex as painful and undesirable as possible. It's a terrible thing to do to a couple, and I think we have to realize that just like in the other part of my practice, fertility, we have to start treating sexual dysfunction as a couple instead of just targeting one person and rejecting the needs of the other.
Right.
Now, with that in mind, one of the things that I think is important is I do have a tendency to make up words when words don't exist to describe things. And I've used the term, and I don't claim I created the term bioidentical, but the term bioidentical, I did help popularize it. What that refers to is giving back the same exact hormone that the body is deficient in. And I think it's important because, I actually do take credit for encouraging Suzanne Summers to use that term with her books, because prior to her book, people were commonly using the term natural or synthetic. And the reality is every one of these hormones is synthetic because they have to be synthesized, meaning created in a laboratory. But whether it's created and converted into something that's biologically identical or not is where the difference between a bioidentical hormone and something else would come. Because keep in mind, a plant is not going to make a bioidentical hormone. It doesn't do that because we don't use the same estrogens plants do. So a bioidentical hormone means if the person needs testosterone, you give them testosterone. If they need estradiol, you give them estradiol. And even though some people view this as controversial, it's the status quo in medicine, in endocrinology. And David can vouch for me on this, that believe it or not, the first hormone that was ever available to give to people was pig thyroid. And as soon as they were able to make, bioidentical thyroid, we've only been prescribing thyroxine and T3 for people ever since, because bioidentical is what the desirable hormone is. Another more recent example is insulin. Until the mid-1990s, whenever someone walked into a pharmacy with an insulin prescription, the pharmacist would say beef or pork insulin because all the insulin came either from cows or from pigs. But since the late 1990s, the only thing that's available now is bioidentical insulin, human insulin. Same thing with growth hormone. People used to use growth hormone that was derived from cows until people were able to produce human bioidentical growth hormone. Now that's the gold standard. It's only in women's health care that people want to give either a horse estrogen or a plant estrogen to a woman and try to convince her that it's better than what her body was naturally making. So bioidentical hormones, in my opinion, are the most desirable. When we can't give bioidentical hormones, and there are some situations where you can't, then you want to give something that's biosimilar. And biosimilar is a term that I invented, and I invented that term to describe a hormone that's very similar to a hormone that's made by the body, but it's not quite identical. Other times, in the field of cancer, for instance, David's very familiar with hormones that are called SERM, selective estrogen receptor modulator. Most people don't know what that means. I call that a biolimited hormone. A biolimited hormone meaning it's got the hormonal activity in one part of the body but not in the other. It's got limited activity. And a hormone antagonist, I call that a bioantagonist because that way you know that it's something to block a hormone action. Finally, getting back to a couple of the things that are also commonly out there, bio-unknowns to me are things that are untested, whether it's a new chemical that's being investigated or whether it's a plant estrogen that we don't know a lot about. It's a bio-unknown. It may be better than what we've had. It may be worse, but we just don't know. And then most concerning are what I like to call the biomutagens. There's a tremendous number of chemicals, as David mentioned in his introduction, that are considered hormone disruptors. And a hormone disruptor is something that can get into your body and wreak havoc, particularly hormonal chaos. And these, I like to call these biomutagens because these are often pollutants, but sometimes they're chemical additives to our food or treatments that are applied to our clothing, or sometimes even things that are included in our cosmetics that we really need to start focusing on so that we can get those out of our population and try to minimize problems like cancers and other things that may be related to some of these hormone-disrupting agents. Right. And that's really, I think, a transition to this issue of cancer because, you know, the way I describe to people what we believe today is the relationship between a hormone and a cancer is that if somebody has a cancer, a hormone can stimulate that cancer to grow if it's a hormonally sensitive cancer. Now, for an instant, I encourage you to forget anything you think you know about science, and I'm going to describe this to you the way I view this problem, is that if you knew nothing about science and you started watering your lawn, and at the end of the month you see that some weeds have appeared on your lawn, you might create a theory and say, you know what, water could turn grass into weeds. And in order to test your theory, because you always have to test a theory, you might call 50 of your friends. And you might say, you know what, I want you to do this experiment for me. Start watering your lawn. I'm going to call you back in a month, and you tell me what happens. And at the end of the month, you call back your 50 friends, and maybe 4 of them have weeds on their lawn. So then you change your theory, and you say, okay, water could turn grass into weeds, but only sometimes. That's the current view that a lot of people have about hormones. Now, when you lift the veil of ignorance, what we understand today is that water can only make weeds appear if the seeds were already there before you started watering it. And that water cannot make a healthy blade of grass become a weed. It can only promote the growth of a weed if the seed was there. And that's what we understand is the relationship between bioidentical hormones and cancers. And if you don't believe me, you can go to the American Cancer Society's website. This is a great graph here that you can see that despite the rising popularity in the 90s, there's been no increase in breast cancer. Keep in mind, if we were causing breast cancers by giving hormones to women in menopause, we would see that this would be rising over time as hormones were becoming more popular. And quite the opposite, we find that it has not been going on. In case you're wondering what this rise over here represents, is this is when mammography became much more commonly used, so breast cancers were just being detected. We don't believe that there were actually more cancers appearing. We were just actually diagnosing more cancers as a result of advances in the technology. But here's what's even more fascinating, is during those years that hormone therapy was gaining in popularity, the risk of dying from breast cancer has been going down, not up. And so again, if we were causing a cancer by promoting the use of hormones, we would not see this kind of a trend. Instead, we would see something more analogous to what was going on with, for instance, lung cancer and cigarettes, where there was a clear correlation between the popularity and, in fact, the outcomes. Now, just a few yeah, go ahead.
But some lung cancers are due to hormonal factors, right?
Lung cancers, did you say?
Yeah, I understand.
Lung cancers related to hormonal factors?
Yeah, probably not with specifically the steroid hormones, but I understand some.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, okay. I do believe you're right, and I'm not an oncologist, but I could tell you that what we see today is that women have greater risks for lung cancer, so that there might be some correlation, but clearly we don't see a higher incidence of cancer, particularly with estrogen and testosterone, which is what I'm focusing on today. There are other hormones that I do believe are involved that have been clinically implicated. But keep in mind that with lung cancer, what we see is that lung cancers specifically, again, we got to dissect it out, David, and talk about biological plausibility. That really it's when cells are actively dividing that you're most likely to see a healthy cell not divide correctly and become a cancer cell. And this is why things that irritate the lungs, like small particles and things like that, can promote damage to the lungs. And then as the lungs are healing, the cells can become damaged. And then if you hit that damaged cell with a hormone, that's like probably the 1-2 punch. But again, that's all theory based on current understandings of the way different types of cancers arise. But what we do know is that the breast doesn't change as a result of the continuation of hormones in the menopause. Instead, it goes through less atrophy, but it still is going through a gradual sense of atrophy based on what we see today.
Got it.
And with that in mind, I want to talk ever so briefly about some male-related issues. I love this slide because it reminds me that even the strongest superheroes do need some help as we age. And the important point being is that, I'm not someone that really encourages the use of the term anti-aging, because I really encourage the term healthy aging. I always say anti-aging in my world would be like if I was talking about flying in an airplane as anti-gravity. Instead, let's talk about healthy aging. And with men, clearly we're starting to see that as men are aging and living longer lives as well, we're seeing men with a variety of symptoms, and only some of them are sexually related symptoms, but symptoms as a result of falling testosterone, things like fatigue, changes in mood, note here impaired cognition, loss of muscle mass and strength, osteoporosis, even problems like anemia that you just don't see in younger men. And what we see is that two things are going on, is that number one, we see reductions in the numbers of, or the amount of testosterone, so that more men have low testosterone levels in their 80s than for men in their 40s. But we also see that there is a difference in the availability of testosterone, and that some men will actually have less bioavailable testosterone even if they still have normal blood levels. And this is why we have to, again, focus on symptoms in trying to decide how, when, and if men should consider hormone replacement as well. And again, the point being is that by giving a man testosterone, you're giving him the benefit of all the things that it can happen at the testosterone receptor, both at the skin, at the muscles, and the bone marrow, and in the brain. But at the same time, you're also giving the man testosterone. And the same thing is true when you give a woman bioidentical testosterone. You can't convert estrogen in the body to testosterone, because that's like trying to take one of the grapes that you plucked off the vine and trying to get it to stick back on. It doesn't work. But you can pluck it off and make it very easily convert from testosterone to estrogen. And here you could see that the list of problems that we believed were caused by testosterone are far fewer than what was believed. If you notice, this is from the very prominent New England Journal of Medicine, not even a recent study from 2004. But look at this right here. In terms of coronary artery disease, no evidence for any correlation whatsoever. And again, this is something that we were all taught was considered a fact. Neutral effect on blood lipids. We do see there could be an increase in red blood cells. If a man is given inappropriate amounts, you could see problems with breast-related issues. But most importantly is what we see is the adverse effects of testosterone have been found with injectable testosterone primarily, because oftentimes people are injected with more than their body actually needed. And this is just one of several studies that shows, again, that you can give men and women testosterone effectively. The reason I selected this study is because this study also looked at DHEA, and the point is that DHEA is a precursor. It's not that much different to trying to give someone cholesterol and hoping their body's going to make it into estrogen or testosterone. But what's happened is DHEA is basically a cholesterol molecule that's had fewer of the carbon atoms plucked off it, but it still is relying on the aging testicles or the aging ovaries to make those final conversions, and the body simply doesn't do it effectively. And that's why DHEA tends to be so very disappointing. I want to make just a few final comments specifically related to Alzheimer's disease, and then if anyone has any questions, I want to make sure we take the time to look at and go over those questions. But if you look at what we see happens in terms of the incidence of Alzheimer's disease, we see that it happens in men less often and less frequently than in women. And again, this is something that's very important, because what we see is that when men do develop dementia, far more often it'll be a vascular type dementia rather than Alzheimer's type dementia. And more studies are showing that it's related to the estrogen levels. This is one study that was looking at 65-year-old men and showed not only did they have more estrogen levels than 65-year-old women that weren't on hormone therapy, but when they followed them prospectively, they found that the men didn't have any decline in cognitive changes in brain functioning, whereas the women that were low on estrogen did have loss of cognitive function. Ironically, the women that were on estrogen did better out of all the groups, both in terms of their cognitive functioning as well as maintaining the estrogen levels in the bloodstream. Another very important, yeah, please.
Just quickly interject. What is the difference between the vascular Alzheimer's and the regular Alzheimer's? Something might want to know.
It's a great question, David. vascular-type Alzheimer's disease is basically, the way to think about it is it's the accumulation of mini strokes. That you have small parts of the brain that are being deprived of blood supply, and what happens is it tends to be something that has what we call a stuttering onset. Someone will lose some functioning, and then they'll be stable, and then they'll lose some more functioning, and then they'll be stable. So it tends to be much more rapid in its progression, but it has this stuttering pace. Whereas Alzheimer's disease is a gradual and progressive decline. It's almost like trying to tell the difference between, light gray and off-white. You know what I mean? It's a very gradual, transition, whereas vascular dementia tends to be these much more measurable changes that occur over shorter periods of time.
Got it.
Now, with that in mind, we've had several studies that have come out in the neurology journals that too often don't make the headlines, where they've found again and again that women that are on estrogen far better than women that are not. And this is one study I pulled out because it was just so very interesting that they found that the women that were on estrogen for the longest actually did as well or better than the men. It's the only study that ever found this, and ironically, this is in opposition to what women are often told. Women are often counseled to use estrogen for the shortest period of time possible, yet study after study finds that women that are on estrogen for longer periods of time are the women that actually have the healthiest brain-related aging issues. And one final comment that I wanted to mention, again, when we go to biological plausibility, we're finding a greater and greater correlation between changes in insulin level and unhealthy brain-related aging. So, trying to keep insulin levels down, and again, staying hormonally balanced is one of the ways to do so. Diet and exercise also help keep insulin levels down. But importantly enough, insulin may actually be a scarier chemical to us in terms of trying to reduce risks of unhealthy brain-related aging issues. And with that, I do think that we've sort of covered a lot of material. I want to make sure that we take time to address any questions and see where we go from there.
Wow. You covered a lot of information here, Robert.
Yeah, I tend to do that. That's why I think it's important to put a cap on it at some point.
Well, that's the problem. Where do you do that? You've been open the can of worms here. Going by the questions I've been pouring in. Quick. I'll just mention a few things myself, and of course, thank you so much for this. But I'll just first of all, that superhero slide you showed, I would caution you about showing that to too many people, especially die-hard superhero fans like me. We don't like to see our superheroes age like that.
Well, exactly, and if we can minimize that, I think it's our responsibility to minimize it, don't you?
Oh, well, yeah, I agree. You used the word biological plausibility a couple of times. Someone wanted to know what you meant by that.
Yeah, what I mean by biological plausibility is I think that whenever we've got a theory that one thing is contributing to or causing another, we have to generate a theory. And David, you and I know in science that the only way you could design a research study is to create a theory. And once you've got a theory, you could test that theory, and then based on the research, you either accept or reject that theory, and you have to move on to something else. Now, the problem is with a lot of the studies that are presented today, and the WHI was a great example, they look at associations that don't have any biological plausibility in order to try to create a link between the finding and what's being measured. I'll give you a great example from the medical research. There was a study that came out many years ago that found that women that went to college were more likely to be diagnosed with breast cancer. Now, immediately the media latched onto this and said, wow, going to college, women were delaying childbearing, and as a result, they were increasing their risk of breast cancer. Or maybe something at college alone was increasing the risk of breast cancer. Lo and behold, somebody came along and did a reanalysis of that study, and what they found is at that time, women that went to college were more likely to have health insurance. Because they had health insurance, they were more likely to get mammograms, and because they were getting mammograms, they were getting diagnosed with breast cancer. So it didn't mean that the people that didn't go to college weren't getting breast cancer, it just wasn't getting diagnosed. But it took someone to go back and actually look for a biologically plausible link before they could actually prove what was the correlation in that study.
Well, someone is coming up with a correlation here between HRT. Well, here's the question. It's kind of long, but I'll pause if you need me to. Question one, I took bioidentical hormone replacement therapy for years. 6 months ago, I had a partial mastectomy for DCIS. That's the kind of cancer. The cancer cells were
yeah.
Right. The cancer cells were greater than 95% estrogen positive and 80% progesterone positive. I am now on tamoxifen and no longer taking HRT. Now she's asking for advice. We don't usually give medical advice over here, but if you feel comfortable saying something about it, that's fine.
Yeah, let me just make a few general comments. I'll tell you something interesting. I'm a fertility specialist, and one of the things that I do in my fertility, the fertility aspect of my practice, and you can verify this because of your oncology background, is that it's recommended now by the American Society of Clinical Oncology that when a young woman with breast cancer is diagnosed, they're often referred to someone like me so that we can freeze eggs or embryos so that after her breast cancer is treated, she could go on and become pregnant. And the reason for that is multiple studies have shown even pregnancy does not cause an increase in the risk of breast cancer recurrence if the woman has her cancer treated. Now, I think that's so very important to point out because tamoxifen is a drug that's widely used, and David, correct me if you think I'm saying anything wrong. I don't believe there's never been a study that shows that tamoxifen can kill a cancer cell. All it can do is slow down the growth of that cancer.
Right.
So the reality is, why slow down the growth of a cancer? If there's still a cancer cell, it should be found, it should be treated, it should be removed or radiated or whatever treatment is going to be used. Why slow it down in terms of its growth and pretend it's not there? To me that doesn't make sense, and this is why I believe that in young women they could go on and carry a pregnancy and have no increased risk of recurrence. Similarly, David can back me up on this, when a woman in her 30s or 40s has breast cancer, nobody recommends that her ovaries be removed because her ovaries are not going to promote the growth of that cancer. So if we're giving a biological equivalent to that, how can we even theorize that that can promote or exacerbate the cancer? It just doesn't make sense to me.
Mm. But she mentions here that 95% estrogen positive and 80% progesterone positive. What do you say about that?
To me, that's good. That basically means that it's a sensitive cancer. In other words, like I'll give you the opposite extreme, and I'll give you this is what happens sometimes if we don't study history. Sometimes we make the same mistakes over and over again. About 75 years ago, there was a miraculous chemical that was discovered called penicillin, and almost every bacteria was sensitive to penicillin. Mm-hmm. And what happened is penicillin became so widely used over the years and prescribed even when people didn't need it that almost all the bacteria today are immune to penicillin. It's almost useless. Now, ironically, the same thing is true, when women are told to take tamoxifen when they don't have cancer. Then when they do develop cancer, if they're going to develop cancer, it tends to be a hormonally immune or a more mutant or aggressive form of cancer. So the reality is, as we understand it today, a hormonally sensitive cancer is one that is a more treatable cancer. It's less primitive. It's less aggressive. So why do we want to promote those cells to become more aggressive and undifferentiated so that they would be even harder to treat if that cancer is, in fact, still growing? It doesn't make sense to me. And ironically, one of the things I can tell you is if you look at the American Cancer Society's website, particularly today, more than 90% of women that are diagnosed with breast cancer have stage 1 breast cancer, okay? And they're going to survive long term, which is defined clinically as more than 5 years. Now, what I'm thinking of is what's that person going to be like 10, 15, maybe 20 years later? One of the things I could tell you is there was a study that was sponsored by the National Institute of Health that was published in 2006 that found that women who had their ovaries removed, which is often recommended by people that aren't knowledgeable about these things, that women that had their ovaries removed were almost 4 times more likely to develop dementia, especially if their ovaries were removed before age 45.
Oh,
and I think that it's kind of shocking that we try to, play up the cancer fear in order to encourage people to do treatments that don't have their long-term interest at heart. Keep in mind, when it comes to the brain, you get one chance. If you damage it, you can't repair it, you can't replace it, you can't transplant it, you can't regrow it. So I think it's so important that we realize that some of these agents, and tamoxifen specifically, and raloxifene is another one, some of these agents have been shown to potentially exacerbate the loss of neurons to the brain. And I'm not saying that to scare anybody, but when we know that some of the chemotherapies and other things can do that, it's clearly a source of concern for me. So my recommendation is that we have to go back and reanalyze these old ideas, because some of these things have become so ingrained with a lack of research. It's just like what I pointed out a few moments ago. David and I were trained that testosterone causes heart disease, and I showed you that all the scientists agree now that that's not the case. But that's what was the dogma for over 50 years.
Wow. Okay. Sherry, why don't you ask a question?
Okay. Boy, we have got so many questions here. We're definitely going to have you back. Okay, let's see. Somebody was wondering about when they take vitamins, they get hot flashes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of the problems is that very often we recommend different things with the best of intentions. Vitamins are basically what are considered supplements. It's supposed to supplement an unhealthy diet. Now, ironically, most of the studies on vitamins have found, one study after another, it's never as good as eating foods that are rich in vitamins. What ends up happening is when something is taken out of its natural source and concentrated and taken it in a big whopping dose that's not physiologic, it can often cause all sorts of symptoms that don't occur if it's taken in a more natural setting. So I really recommend for anyone that's having a problem with supplements, try to sit down with a nutritionist and see if you can come up with a food, food choices that might minimize the need for supplements, and then you can only take the supplements you're really needing, because chances are something in the supplements you're taking is way too much compared to what your needs are.
Good.
Right.
Also, if our hormone levels are always shifting, how are blood tests really reliable? How does the blood test work if your hormone levels are always changing?
Sherry, you asked me one of my favorite questions. This is why I think tests are over-ordered today. Because unfortunately, most of the people that order tests don't even know how to order them, let alone how to interpret them. How you order a test, it needs to be guided. Some tests should only be ordered in the morning. Others should only be ordered when you're fasting. Believe it or not, a man's testosterone level can vary by 60% from the time he wakes up in the morning till this time of the day in the evening.
Oh, wow.
And so if you give the same man a lab slip and he goes at 4 o'clock versus if he goes at 9 o'clock, you're going to get a very different test result. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that interpret these things don't even know that. What I think is most important is, number one, you have to order tests properly, and I think a lot of my colleagues don't. And so even more importantly than that is you have to try to correlate the test with someone's symptoms, because every test has a wide range of normal. And so what's normal for one individual may not be normal for someone else. What I typically try to do in my practice, because I don't really rely heavily on tests at all. In fact, usually I can predict what the test results are going to be on the rare times I want to order it. But when I have patients that want to order tests, I say, you know what, let's get you feeling great. And once you're symptom-free, let's then order the test, and I tell them what time of day to do it and under what conditions, and then we draw a smiley face on it and say, this is what's normal for this person. But instead, to order a test when someone's not feeling well or at random without even really correlating it with how they're feeling doesn't make any sense at all. Symptoms matter.
So you would go by symptoms as one of the best ways to gauge whether or not to treat someone with hormonal therapy?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the thing that's amazing, and especially when you're sticking with a bioidentical hormone, David, The thing that's amazing is that any hormone our body makes, and I've said this in countless number of lectures, and nobody's ever found an exception yet, and someone will eventually, but there's no single hormone that I've ever found that your body makes that can make you feel better that's causing you any harm. In other words, if you have too much of any hormone, it's going to cause certain symptoms. If you have too little, it's going to cause symptoms. But if you're feeling good, that hormone is doing the right thing. And I think that's so important that this is why I try to train physicians when I'm doing lectures to healthcare providers that they need to ask their patient about their symptoms. They need to interpret those symptoms accurately. And ironically, that's also the best way to individualize your therapy.
How do you feel about saliva levels? Testing
it's even more useless than blood levels. Because believe it or not, the idea about saliva testing is that it's supposed to represent a more stable level. But there's a couple of problems with that theory. Number one, they tend to be very inconsistent, so we need more accurate tests even to be able to do good research on saliva testing. But then there are other problems too. Number two is that there's very poor correlation between what's in the saliva and what's in the bloodstream. Keep in mind, when we're talking about the brain, we're making estimates based on what's in the bloodstream and what is actually inside the central nervous system, because not everything can get past what we call the blood-brain barrier. So it's even only an estimate when we look at blood to estimate what's in the brain. There's absolutely no correlation between what's in the saliva and what's in the brain. Finally, and maybe most importantly, there are several ways our body gets rid of things it doesn't want. One of them is through the digestive system and through the urinary tract. Another is through perspiration, which is why sometimes people will get what I like to call the garlic sweats if they eat too much garlic. But ironically, a lot of things, a lot of toxins can sometimes be excreted through the saliva as well. So how do you tell the difference between something your body is trying to get rid of and actually correlate that with some state of health? I've never seen any good research studies on it. I don't look at saliva testing at all.
Okay.
And the thing that's important is I really encourage people, if anyone thinks I'm wrong, email me. My email address is up there. Send me some medical research correlating saliva testing, and I'm talking about specifically the sex hormones that we're looking at today, and anything that we're talking about, I'll look at that study, and if I'm wrong, I'll come back and I'll explain to you why I was wrong. But I don't think it's going to happen because I think I'd know about it.
Someone has sent in a chat saying this couple were given a grant by the NHI. Let me see that real quick.
That they were what?
They have 1, 2, or 3 NIH grants for saliva testing of hormones.
Yeah, but that's tests. I mean, that's exactly it. It's still being investigated. So that would be like a bio-unknown. I mean, that's part of medical research, and someday they might be useful, but I don't think it's something that we could use clinically today. Because ironically, when someone's given grants to do research, you have to sign an informed consent, and that informed consent acknowledges that it's not an accepted part of therapy and that it's not a proven method at this time. And so I think we need to be open and honest about that before we sell people on different tests.
Got it.
Okay.
Have you ever, Sherry, let me ask this one of yours.
Go ahead.
Have you ever heard of women having scar tissue on the inside of the uterus from infections?
Absolutely, yes.
Right.
That does happen. It's a condition called Asherman syndrome.
Right. Okay. I remember that from medical school.
Yeah.
Okay.
When I come back to talk about fertility, we'll go over that.
Okay. With whatever you have to say about it. Okay. That doesn't. Sherry, go ahead.
Okay. This person says, I'm experiencing the whatchamacallit problem.
Mm-hmm.
Can hormone replacement therapy fix the problem, or is the damage already done, and can I just only keep it from getting worse?
It's a great question, and all of the current research indicates that in most people it can be reversed, especially if it's hormone-related. And what's important is if it's not relieved by just correcting estrogen levels alone, sometimes you do have to look at some other things like thyroid levels. And ironically, if the problem does persist or keep getting worse, it's important to also look for other causes as well. Not everything is caused by hormones, but this is probably one of the most reversible and one of the easiest ones to try to manage. One of my favorite research studies actually looked at having women reading different tongue twisters during different times in their menstrual cycle. And it's amazing. Women perform much better on these tests than men, but it was amazing how much their performance would vary according to what even their naturally produced hormones were doing. So clearly, there's a very strong correlation in many, many situations, and I would absolutely remain hopeful that you'd completely regain the function that was lost.
That is very good news, very good news. Also, can a patient that has lupus be on hormone therapy, or would it cause the lupus to flare up?
It's a great question. And what we find is that in the vast majority of situations, especially when you go with transdermal estrogens, it will not cause, but it also will not prevent a flare-up of the lupus. You know, there's been a tremendous amount of research that we do see that there are differences in the way a woman's immune system responds compared to men, but the important thing is in a variety of autoimmune diseases, including lupus, including rheumatoid arthritis, including multiple sclerosis, that very often the estradiol can actually, you know, it's not going to really exacerbate it. It's not going to really make it any less likely, but what it's going to do is make it so that the person can function in a healthier state in their overall health. There has been some research that one of the other hormones called estriol, which is a different form of estrogen that's very weak, it has very little brain-related activity, may actually have some additional properties that are beneficial to women with autoimmune diseases, but that's very investigational at this stage.
Sherry, you want to go ahead and ask that next one?
Oh, okay. Let's see.
What are the hormonal implications, risks of vasectomy? What is the remedy for that?
Hormonal risks of what? Mastectomy?
Vasectomy.
Vasectomy. Oh, yeah, vasectomy, which is basically male sterilization, doesn't really have any real hormonal implications based on all the available research. It's not a recommended method of contraception, in my opinion, because as a fertility specialist, it keeps me busy because of the number of men that have a vasectomy and then change their mind and want to have more kids. But I can absolutely reassure you that it has not been shown to have any consistent, measurable hormonal changes in the men that undergo vasectomy.
Okay. If somebody has panic attacks, are hormones affecting that? This person says they're estrogen dominant. Would that be creating the anxiety?
Yeah. You know, the idea of estrogen dominance is another fictitious creation by people that really aren't scientifically aware, because the reality is if a woman is in her menstrual cycle, a woman that's having regular cycles, there are days that she's going to be estrogen dominant, and then there's other days when she's going to be progesterone dominant, and there's other days when she's going to be deficient in one or both. So the reality is you got to go back to the concept of the mobile, because a mobile, as we know, is a very kinetic or dynamic structure. But what we do see is that for people with panic-related disorders, sometimes they can be worsened by high estrogen levels. Sometimes they could be worsened by drop in progesterone levels. So what's best is to try to correlate the symptoms with the menstrual cycle if the listener has a menstrual cycle, and if not, to make subtle changes to the regimen with your healthcare provider where you would either raise or lower the estrogen or progesterone levels, and keep very careful notes into how your body responds, because you might find that you can tweak it just right to minimize those symptoms. And ironically, and I'm not trying to plug my book, but in my book I have a very specific chapter. I have different chapters that deal with sexual dysfunction versus mood disorders versus chronic pain disorders. And in the chapter on mood disorders, I talk very specifically on a variety of ways to try to manipulate the hormonal balance to try to minimize symptoms like panic and generalized anxiety disorder.
Now we're talking about the perfect balance of the book, right?
Correct.
We know of some companies that have developed phytosterols, like the plant sterols. I think you alluded to that earlier on, and they've come up with some really great results with people. How do these compare with the bioidenticals?
Well, first of all, it's so important to point out that anything that can do some good always has the potential to do some harm. You know, there really is nothing that is only got a beneficial profile to it. And I'll give you an example, because I've been vegetarian for going on 16 years. And,
Wow.
you know, there have been studies that have shown that too much tofu consumption, for instance, can actually cause all sorts of adverse cognitive problems associated with aging. Now, these were very, very high levels that were taken by people that also had other things going on as well. But ironically, no matter how much tofu you're eating, you usually can't get the same level of phytosterols that you get in these different supplements. So I think that we have to classify these things as what I like to call a bio-unknown. We might find out with time that they have beneficial effects, but we might also find that they have adverse effects. And I think we just have to acknowledge, to call it a bio-unknown doesn't mean that it's dangerous. It just means that we have to acknowledge that the jury isn't out on it yet. And that just because someone's selling it and they claim that they've got some great results doesn't mean that it's really going to be what we thought it was going to be based on early results. So I think we have to look at these things very critically.
Okay. If stress hormones are kicking in and creating migraines, why does that last so long? It says the pain does not set in for about 30 minutes. They're wondering about Imitrex as a...
Yeah, well, believe it or not, migraines are, again, a very specific topic that I actually do address in my book, because I've actually sat on an advisory panel for the American Academy of Neurologists, the AACN. And what's so important is that they actually acknowledge how hormone fluctuations can contribute and exacerbate or potentially diminish migraines. And the important thing is migraine sufferers are very different. And most importantly is what we call a migraine is actually a series of events. And these series of events usually have a triggering point, and oftentimes that trigger can be a shift in hormones, but sometimes it can be, you know, a bad night's sleep, or sometimes it could be certain foods, or sometimes it can be stress. But the important thing is you could think of it as if it's the first domino that is the first in a chain reaction, and that it sets off this cascade of events that can go on and continue and then become self-perpetuate. You know, the drug that you mentioned, for instance, Imitrex, is a very good drug for minimizing the effects of a migraine once it goes on. But one of the problems is that Imitrex, for instance, is a short-acting drug, and it'll often promote what's called a rebound headache because it wears off very quickly, and then you can actually get a worse headache as a result from that. You know, and so it's important that we realize that we have to look at each migraine sufferer differently, trying to identify what that person's triggers are, and then you can actually come up with therapies to individualize and try to minimize the migraine effects. So, you know, the listener is absolutely onto it that there's a correlation, but it's not as simple as cause and effect. And what's also very important is that the more we learn about stress hormones, there's also ways you could learn to turn off stress hormones, sometimes through acupuncture, sometimes through meditation, even through things like walking a labyrinth or doing regular yoga practice. You can absolutely minimize, you know, these stress hormones, and as a result, you can dramatically reduce a variety of stress-related illnesses, not to mention improve healing for people that have problems like cancer, heart disease, or stroke as well.
Okay, thank you. What about using the bioidentical hormones, the three, the estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, in like a rhythmic cycling kind of way where each day you're doing different pumps and that whole way of doing things? Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, it's basically one way of doing things. The important thing is bioidentical hormones can be safely done in a cyclic fashion, you know, as you describe it, where a woman goes through something that tries to simulate a menstrual cycle, or it can also be done in a continuous fashion. And it should be done individualized on a case-by-case basis. I could tell you there's nothing that's more cruel in my mind than to try to make someone that's had a lifetime suffering with premenstrual syndrome and try to make that patient continue to cycle. Because cycling is not the best thing for every patient. And again, this is where individualization of treatment is important, because it can be done safely either way, and it's just a matter of talking to the patient, finding out what her preferences, and then empowering her to change courses if she decides that whichever route she started out on isn't the way she wants to continue.
That's good. Thank you. And how are we doing with time with you? Are you still good for a few more questions?
Well, they haven't let the guard dogs out in my building yet, so I guess I'm fine.
Okay. David, you want to ask a few?
I was kidding, by the way. They don't have guard dogs.
Oh. That's a relief. Did we lose David?
I think he went to sleep. I think we did lose him.
I'm sorry. I was on mute. I was on mute. Pardon me.
Yeah, sure.
Right. Yeah, I fell asleep, huh?
Going to ask a couple?
Sure. Robert, if you need to send me a chat message and just let me know how you're doing, okay? And then we'll just go with what you say. So you just send me a chat message whenever you can. Okay?
Okay.
Can you hear me? All right.
Yes,
all right.
I hear you.
I wasn't sure. All right. What about the different PG levels? I think she's referring to progesterone levels. Isn't a patch better than a cream or lotion in achieving higher levels under steady state? Is there a difference between a bioidentical and bioequivalent hormones?
In terms of, so is the question asking about a progesterone patch?
What about the different PG levels? I just assumed it's progesterone.
Yeah, because ironically, progesterone cannot be absorbed effectively through the skin. You know, what happens is, if I were to flip the slides back to the earlier diagram where you could see that progesterone is closer to the molecule cholesterol than any of the other sex steroids we're talking about. And cholesterol can't be absorbed through the skin either. You know, I always tell people you could do a great experiment and rub butter on your skin and try to see how long it takes to absorb, and you'll notice that it doesn't get absorbed because it's too large. The same thing is true of progesterone. I could tell you that I've been involved in research studies, and one company really tried to come up with a progesterone that would be absorbable through the skin. It's like the estrogen patches. And the size of the patch, it was almost like a small T-shirt because it had to be so big in order to get it absorbed so that nobody would wear it. It wasn't practical. And ironically, you would find that you absorb a lot more of it on a day in Sacramento when it's 105 than you would absorb on a day in Minnesota when it's 15 degrees. So it would be tremendously variable. And that's why, to this day, there's not an effective progesterone that can be administered transdermally. There will be probably at some point, but it's not available yet.
Okay. Is there a difference between bioidentical and bioequivalent hormones?
In terms of bioidentical and bioequivalent is really, it's a newer term that just, there's no uniform definition. So I would ask whoever is defining it as bioequivalent. But to me, it sounds like a similar thing. But, the biggest problem with a lot of these, just like with the old terms of natural versus synthetic, is that most people didn't bother to publicize a definition. And that's exactly why I came up with, terms that were sort of self-explanatory so that they didn't require a detailed explanation.
Okay, we got just one question left, and that would be this. What is the place of omega-3s in the hormonal treatment for brain health?
Omega-3 fatty acids are absolutely critical in terms of brain health. These are the nutritional components that we call essential fatty acids. What makes them essential is that our body cannot manufacture them. But yet, ironically, they're critical elements in terms of building and maintaining healthy nerves. And so it's absolutely important that there's a certain amount that we all need. They're getting easier and easier to come by because there's different, butter substitutes, and you can buy eggs that are supplemented with them. But then again, for people that want to take supplements, they can get them that way too if they don't want to get them just through healthy, what we call functional foods. But it's absolutely important. And I do talk, again, about the omega-3 fatty acids in the book as well, because I think a healthy diet and a healthy lifestyle is a key cornerstone to actually healthy aging.
Well, that's great. And we actually had someone come do a 2-hour special for us on omega-3s, and That's available too on our website. Yeah, he was on for a long time. Apparently, it's one topic that few researchers and scientists argue about. People argue about vitamins and minerals. People argue about other kinds of supplements. But when it comes to omega-3s, everybody is in agreement that they're absolutely necessary for everyone, whether in supplement form or in food form.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
but the same thing is true in vitamins, too. People will debate that they need to take it as a pill versus as a healthy food. But everybody knows that there's certain nutrients and certain things that we absolutely need in order to maintain healthy functioning.
Right. Right. Well, folks, this has been probably one of the most instructive webinars we've had here. Please, 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 the MP3s will be available afterwards within a day or two. The slides are already available on the website. The book, too, if you don't want to do too much searching, just go straight to our website. It is in the resource section among the books, and you can actually just buy it straight from Amazon.com through our site, so you don't have to do any searching. We want to thank everyone again for joining us for the webinar, especially Dr. Greene. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your technical know-how about how this whole thing works. Yeah. Any last words you want to leave us with?
Yeah, absolutely. 2 words: symptoms matter.
Symptoms matter. Thank you so much. Well, everyone, have a great night, and we'll see you on Tuesday. Remember, take control of your health. God bless.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.